At 4:50 in the afternoon on December 26, 1944, a single American tank rumbled through the smoking ruins of a Belgian village called Ardennes. Snow covered the frozen fields. Shell craters pocked the road. German bodies lay twisted in the ditches where artillery had caught those minutes before. The tank was an M4A3E2 Sherman, an up-armored variant the crews called a jumbo. Its name was Cobra King. Its commander was First Lieutenant Charles Bulge, junior of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division. He stood in the turret, scanning the tree line ahead, searching for the men he had been fighting to reach for 7 brutal days. The tank crested a small rise and approached a concrete bunker, part of the old Belgian fortification system. Foxholes dotted the snow around it. American paratroopers in dirty uniforms rose from those holes, their faces gaunt and their eyes hollow from a week without sleep. One of them walked toward the tank. First Lieutenant Dwayne Webster of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion extended his hand to the tankers. The first words of the relief were simple. "Glad to see you." 20 minutes later, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the cigar-chomping commander of the 37th Tank Battalion, shook hands with Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division. The siege of Bastogne was broken. The most desperate gamble of the Western Front had failed. And the man who made it happen, Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., had just delivered on the most audacious promise of the Second World War. This is the story of how Patton turned 100,000 men 90 degrees in a blizzard. It took him 48 hours to begin. It took 7 days to break through. And it remains the greatest battlefield maneuver in the history of modern warfare. George Smith Patton, Jr. was 59 years old in December 1944. He commanded the 3rd United States Army, a force of approximately 250,000 men organized into multiple corps and divisions, equipped with thousands of tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and aircraft. The Third Army had landed in France in July 1944 and had swept across the continent with a speed that stunned both allies and enemies. From Normandy to the Moselle River, Patton's forces had liberated tens of thousands of square miles of occupied territory. They had killed or captured more Germans than any other American command. Patton himself was a paradox. Born to wealth in California, educated at West Point, he had studied cavalry tactics in an age of horses and emerged as the prophet of armored warfare. He believed in reincarnation and claimed to remember past lives as a Roman legionnaire, a knight at Crécy, and a soldier under Napoleon. He wore ivory-handled revolvers on his hips, polished his helmet to a mirror shine, and delivered profanity-laced speeches that would have ended the career of any other general. Yet behind the flamboyance was a mind of extraordinary depth. Patton read military history obsessively. He studied logistics with the intensity of an accountant. He drilled his staff until they could execute complex operations in their sleep, and he possessed an instinct for battle that bordered on precognition. The Third Army staff was the finest in the European theatre. Most of these officers had served with Patton since North Africa. Brigadier General Hobart Gay, the Chief of Staff, had been at Patton's side through Sicily and France. Brigadier General Halley Maddox, the G3 operations officer, could translate Patton's aggressive vision into executable orders within hours. Colonel Walter Muller, the G4 logistics chief, had mastered the impossible art of keeping 250,000 men supplied across a continent. And Colonel Oskar Koch, the G2 intelligence officer, possessed an analytical brilliance that would prove decisive in the days ahead. These men had built something remarkable. The Third Army was not merely a collection of divisions. It was a machine, finely tuned, relentlessly drilled, capable of speeds and feats that other commands could not match. When the crisis came, this machine would be tested as no army had ever been tested before. In December 1944, the war in Europe appeared to be approaching its final chapter. The Allied armies had liberated France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and much of the Netherlands. They stood along the German frontier from Switzerland to the North Sea. The Soviet Union was driving into Poland from the east. Germany was being squeezed from both directions. Allied intelligence estimated that the Wehrmacht was a spent force, capable of local counterattacks but incapable of mounting a major offensive. The question was not whether Germany would be defeated, but when. Most commanders expected victory by spring. This assessment was catastrophically wrong. Adolf Hitler had been planning a massive counteroffensive since September 1944. He gathered his remaining reserves in secret, assembling approximately 200,000 to 250,000 troops, nearly 1,000 tanks, and over 1,600 artillery pieces. 3 German armies, the 6th Panzer Army, the 5th Panzer Army, and the 7th Army, would strike through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. Their objective was the port of Antwerp, 125 miles to the northwest. If the Germans could split the British and American armies and seize this vital supply hub, Hitler believed he could force a negotiated peace in the west. The chosen attack sector was the Ardennes, a region of dense forests, narrow valleys, and winding roads. It was the same terrain through which the Germans had attacked in May 1940, bypassing the Maginot Line and conquering France in 6 weeks. Allied commanders considered the Ardennes unsuitable for major operations. They had stationed only 4 divisions there, stretched across 80 miles of front. Military doctrine said that sector required at least 14 divisions to defend properly. Major General Troy Middleton's 8th Corps held this ghost front with exhausted veterans and green replacements, waiting for reinforcements that never came. The Germans achieved complete surprise. Radio silence was maintained for weeks before the attack. Troop movements occurred at night, under strict blackout conditions. The weather cooperated perfectly. Thick fog, heavy snow, and overcast skies grounded the overwhelming Allied air forces that might have spotted the buildup. Intelligence officers at Supreme Headquarters noted increased rail traffic and troop concentrations, but their warnings were dismissed or ignored. The Germans were believed to be incapable of offensive action. This belief would cost thousands of American lives. At 3rd Army headquarters in Nancy, France, the situation looked very different. Colonel Oskar Koch had been tracking German movements since early November. Unlike his counterparts at Supreme Headquarters, Koch trusted his own analysis over the prevailing assumptions. He studied patterns, he counted trains, he mapped troop movements with obsessive precision. On November 23, his intelligence section identified panzer units, leaving the Westphalia region, and noted a powerful striking force, with an estimated 500 tanks being held in strategic reserve. Koch connected the dots that other intelligence officers missed. He noted that 9 German divisions faced the 8th Corps, almost 3 more than opposed the entire 3rd Army. This was backwards. If the Germans were incapable of offensive action, why would they concentrate forces against the weakest sector of the Allied line? 15 panzer divisions were in the west, but only 5 were in contact with Allied forces. Where were the other 10? On a single day in November, 226 German rail movements had been detected moving toward the Ardennes sector. The trains were not bringing replacements to the front. They were massing forces for something far larger. Patton listened to these briefings with growing alarm. On November 25, he confided to his diary a warning that proved prophetic. "First Army is making a terrible mistake leaving the 8th Corps static," he wrote. "It is highly probable that the Germans are building up east of them." On December 9th, Koch delivered a comprehensive assessment to the 3rd Army staff. He warned that the enemy concentration in the Ardennes represented a serious threat. Patton's response was immediate. "We will be in a position to meet whatever happens," he told his officers. By December 12, Patton had instructed his Chief of Staff and Operations Officer to draw up specific contingency plans for a 3rd Army counterattack into the 8th Corps sector. These were not vague concepts. They were detailed operational plans with specific routes, timetables, and unit assignments. 3 days later, German forces across the entire Ardennes front went on radio silence. Koch's intelligence section noted the ominous quiet. At 3rd Army, the contingency plans were ready. December 16, 1944, began like any ordinary day along the Western Front. At 3rd Army headquarters in Nancy, staff officers reviewed plans for the ongoing offensive toward the Saar industrial region. At Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, General Dwight Eisenhower attended meetings and prepared for a wedding ceremony for one of his aides. At 1st Army headquarters in Spa, Belgium, officers worried about supply shortages and replacement troops. No one expected what was about to happen. In the Ardennes, the men of the 8th Corps woke to darkness and bitter cold. Temperatures at Bastogne registered 14 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly -10 degrees Celsius. Fog hung thick in the valleys, Snow covered the forest floor. The front had been quiet for weeks. Some units had not heard a shot fired in anger for days. Soldiers wrote letters home, played cards, and counted the days until Christmas. The war seemed very far away. At 05:30 hours, a massive artillery barrage shattered the pre-dawn silence. Approximately 1,600 German guns opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes. Shells tore through American positions, destroying bunkers, severing telephone lines, and killing soldiers in their foxholes. The shock was absolute. Communications collapsed. Units could not reach their headquarters. Headquarters could not reach the rear. The fog of war became literal as smoke and snow mixed with the natural mist to reduce visibility to a few dozen yards. Then the infantry came. 3 German armies, comprising roughly 200,000 troops and nearly 1,000 tanks, surged westward into the most thinly held sector of the Allied line. They came with searchlights bouncing off the low clouds to create artificial moonlight. They came with English-speaking commandos in American uniforms to spread confusion behind the lines. They came with new Tiger tanks and fresh divisions that Allied intelligence swore did not exist. The blow fell with devastating force. German stormtroops overran outposts before defenders could react. Panzer columns smashed through roadblocks. American units that had held their positions for weeks suddenly found themselves surrounded, cut off, and fighting for survival. In the Schnee-Eifel, 2 entire regiments of the 106th Infantry Division, approximately 7,000 men, were encircled and forced to surrender. It was the largest mass capitulation of American forces in the European theatre. Within hours, the German penetration had reached depths of several miles. By nightfall, the situation was catastrophic. The Ardennes front had collapsed. At Versailles, General Omar Bradley initially dismissed the reports as a spoiling attack. Supreme Commander Eisenhower saw it differently. "That is no spoiling attack," he told Bradley. 100 miles to the south, at 3rd Army headquarters in Nancy, Patton had already recognized the scope of the disaster. And unlike every other commander in the Allied chain, he had a plan. On the morning of December 17, Patton told his morning briefing that he was now convinced the attack in the north was the real thing. His G3, Brigadier General Maddox, saw opportunity in the crisis. "If they will roll with the punch up north," Maddox said, "we can pinwheel the enemy before he gets very far. In a week we could expose the whole German rear and trap their main forces west of the Rhine." Patton agreed. He ordered his staff to accelerate the contingency planning. 3 specific attack options were developed, each with a code name. The first option, codenamed Cent, would attack north through Diekirch, cutting the Bulge at its base. The second option, codenamed Nickel, would attack from Arlon north to Bastogne along the main highway. The third option, codenamed Dime, would attack against the western nose of the Bulge via Neufchâteau and Saint-Hubert. By the evening of December 18, the situation had deteriorated sharply. General Bradley telephoned Patton to describe a German penetration far deeper than expected. A 50-mile gap had been blown in the American lines. Panic was spreading through headquarters across the theatre. Patton replied that he could have 2 divisions moving by the next day and a third within 24 hours. The Saar offensive, 3rd Army's scheduled drive toward Frankfurt, was cancelled. "What the hell?" Patton said. "We will still be killing Krauts." That evening at 8:15, Patton and his principal staff met with Major General John Milliken, commander of the 3rd Corps, to agree on approach march routes. Specific roads were assigned to each division. Traffic control points were designated. Supply dumps were repositioned. By midnight, the 1st Combat Command of the 4th Armoured Division was already rolling north toward Longwy. The pivot had begun before anyone ordered it. At 7 in the morning on December 19, Patton briefed his key staff and corps commanders at Nancy. The atmosphere was electric. Maps covered every wall. Officers who had been planning an offensive toward the Saar now faced a completely different war. Patton issued his guidance with characteristic directness. "I want you, gentlemen, to start making plans for pulling the 3rd Army out of its eastward attack," he said. "Change the direction 90 degrees, moving to Luxembourg and attacking north." The room fell silent. Such a maneuver, executed in the middle of a major battle, violated every principle of military doctrine. Patton did not care. He had crystallized his 3 contingency plans. He wrote the code names on a slip of paper and handed it to General Gay with instructions. Whichever code word comes by telephone, Gay was told, activate that plan immediately. Then Patton addressed the assembled officers. Third Army has a chance to go down in history as the greatest army of this war, he declared. We are going to attack the enemy on his exposed flank and end the war this side of the Siegfried Line. At 9:15, Patton departed for Verdun in an armoured jeep. With him rode Colonel Paul Harkins, his deputy chief of staff, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Codman, his aide-de-camp, Colonel Walter Muller, the logistics chief, and Lieutenant Colonel Richard Stillman. They drove through freezing rain on roads clogged with military traffic. The meeting that awaited them would determine the fate of the Western Front. The conference convened at the Caserne de Jardin-Fontaine in Verdun, a cold, gloomy French stone barracks. The attendees kept their overcoats on. A pot-bellied stove barely heated the second-floor conference room. Eisenhower arrived at approximately 11 in the morning in his armor-plated Cadillac. Observers described him as looking grave, almost ashen. At least 16 men crowded the room. Eisenhower, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, Bradley, Lieutenant General Jacob Devers of the 6th Army Group, Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, the Supreme Headquarters Chief of Staff, Major General Kenneth Strong, the Intelligence Chief, Major General Harold Bull, the Operations Chief, and various staff officers. Field Marshal Montgomery refused to attend any meeting not held at his own headquarters. Eisenhower opened with words that set the tone. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster, he declared. There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table. Patton pushed further. Hell, let us have the guts to let the bastards go all the way to Paris, he said. Then we will really cut them off and chew them up. Eisenhower cut him off sharply. George, that is fine, but the enemy must never be allowed to cross the Meuse. The intelligence picture was presented. Discussion turned to Bastogne, the small Belgian plateau town where 6 major highways converged. Control of Bastogne was essential to German logistics. If the Americans could hold it, the German offensive would be strangled. If the Germans took it, they could pour troops and supplies westward to the Meuse River. Eisenhower decided the immediate priority was to strengthen the southern shoulder while driving to relieve Bastogne. Then came the question that would define the meeting and arguably the war. Eisenhower looked at Patton. George, I want you to command this move, under Brad's supervision, of course, making a strong counterattack with at least 6 divisions. When can you start? Patton's reply electrified the room. As soon as you are through with me, he said. I can attack the day after tomorrow morning. Lieutenant Colonel Codman later described what happened. There was a stir, a shuffling of feet, as those present straightened up in their chairs. In some faces, skepticism. But through the room, a current of excitement leaped. Some British officers openly laughed. A staff officer recalled that the promise almost knocked him out of his chair. Eisenhower accused Patton of being fatuous and urged him to take 3 days instead of 2 to avoid attacking piecemeal. Bradley cautioned that Patton should give himself some leeway. What none of them knew, except Colonel Harkins standing quietly behind Patton, was that the movement was already underway. Divisions were already on the road. Supply points were already being established. Maps were already being printed. As the generals filed out, Patton pulled Harkins aside. Telephone Gay, he ordered. Give him the code name, Nickel. Tell him to get started. Gay received the call and activated the plan. The Ardennes to Bastogne axis was confirmed. As Eisenhower walked to his car, he made a quip. Funny thing, George, every time I get a new star, I get attacked. Patton fired back. And every time you get attacked, Ike, I pull you out. The 90-degree pivot demanded the reorientation of an entire field army. Roughly 250,000 men and over 133,000 vehicles had to be turned from an eastward-facing front in the Saar to a northward attack axis through Luxembourg into Belgium. This was not simply a matter of pointing units in a new direction. Entire supply lines had to be rebuilt. Thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel, and rations had to be repositioned. 20,000 miles of communications wire had to be strung, 57 tons of new maps, hundreds of thousands of sheets covering terrain the Third Army had never planned to operate in, had to be printed and distributed. Colonel Walter Muller orchestrated the logistics with extraordinary efficiency. The supply switch was concluded in fewer than 14 hours. A quartermaster transfer point was established at Longwy, France, selected for its rail connections to Verdun. 100,000 gallons of gasoline were loaded aboard army trucks at Brian-Mansieulles. Rations were loaded on railcars at Verdun. 63,000 tons of supplies shifted in 5 days. 4,500 tons of ammunition moved per day. 2,800 miles of road were reconnoitred by transport officers. 108 battalions of corps and army artillery, a total of 1,296 guns of 105 mm or larger, were repositioned to support the attack. The 3 assault divisions moved in sequence. The 4th Armoured Division under Major General Hugh Gaffey covered 150 miles in 19 hours from the Saar to the Arlon assembly area. This represented a sustained speed of roughly 8 miles per hour over icy roads, an extraordinary rate for a heavy armoured formation. The 80th Infantry Division under Major General Horace McBride travelled approximately 150 miles via Thionville to Luxembourg City, with headlights blazing despite the threat of air attack. The 26th Infantry Division under Major General Willard Paul moved approximately 100 miles from Metz to Arlon beginning December 20. Road conditions were appalling. Ice coated every surface. Vehicles slid off road crowns on downhill sections. Drivers encountered landslides, weakened bridges, bomb craters, and wrecked vehicles requiring detours. Tank lubricants thickened in the cold. Batteries lost capacity. Engines refused to start. Mechanics worked through the night with frozen fingers to keep vehicles running. Recovery crews dragged stalled tanks off icy slopes with cables that snapped in the cold. The soldiers themselves suffered enormously. Most had been in continuous combat for months. They were exhausted before the march began. Now they drove through the night without sleep, without hot food, without adequate winter clothing. Men dozed at the wheel and crashed into ditches. Infantrymen riding in open trucks huddled together for warmth, their breath freezing on their collars. Those who dismounted to stretch found they could barely walk on numb feet. Frostbite claimed dozens before they ever reached the fighting. Traffic control was a nightmare of complexity. Multiple divisions moving on the same roads had to be sequenced precisely. Military police stood at every major intersection, directing convoys through the darkness by flashlight. A single breakdown could halt a column for hours. Tow trucks worked constantly to clear disabled vehicles. Engineers reinforced bridges that groaned under the weight of Sherman tanks. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the famous Ghost Army, transmitted fake radio traffic to deceive the Germans about the movement's direction, broadcasting phony communications suggesting the 4th Armoured and 80th Infantry were going into reserve rather than pivoting north. The deception bought precious time. German commanders looking for the American counterattack expected it to come from the west. They never imagined Patton could redeploy so quickly from the south. While Patton's army raced northward, the garrison at Bastogne fought for survival against overwhelming odds. The 101st Airborne Division had been resting at Camp Montmelon-le-Grand near Reims, 107 miles away, when the crisis broke. Ordered to mobilize on December 17, the paratroopers loaded into open-air trucks in drizzle and sleet. Their commander, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was in Washington at a staff conference. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the division artillery commander, assumed acting command. By 9 in the morning on December 19, the entire division had closed into its assembly area west of Bastogne, a mere 4 hours ahead of the leading German forces. The defending garrison was larger and more diverse than popular memory suggests. Beyond the 101st's 11,800 men, the perimeter sheltered Combat Command B of the 10th Armoured Division, with approximately 2,800 men under Colonel William Roberts. It sheltered the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion with its M18 Hellcat tank destroyers. It sheltered the 969th Field Artillery Battalion, an all-African-American unit with 155mm howitzers that would earn the first Distinguished Unit Citation awarded to a black combat unit. It sheltered survivors of Combat Command R, 9th Armoured Division, and numerous engineer, anti-aircraft, and service units pressed into infantry roles. The total defending force numbered approximately 22,800 men. The encirclement was complete by late on December 20. The pocket measured roughly 8 kilometers in diameter. The supply situation rapidly became critical. In a devastating blow, the 326th Airborne Medical Company, the division's only surgical facility, was overrun by a German Kampfgruppe on the night of December 19 to 20. 130 medical personnel were captured along with all their supplies and equipment. The division could no longer provide advanced emergency surgical care. Improvised aid stations were staffed by medics pulled from artillery, anti-aircraft, and tank destroyer units. Belgian civilians donated liquor as the only available anesthetic. By December 22, artillery ammunition was restricted to 10 rounds per gun per day. Some guns had no high explosive shells remaining. Gunners improvised. They fired propaganda leaflets at German positions for lack of anything else. Food rations were exhausted by December 23. The garrison ate K rations salvaged from destroyed vehicles and whatever the Belgian civilians could spare. Water came from melted snow. Coffee was a memory. Hot food was a luxury few experienced. The cold was relentless. Temperatures dropped to 0 degrees Fahrenheit at night, roughly minus 18 degrees Celsius. Soldiers in foxholes had no sleeping bags. They wrapped themselves in blankets, overcoats, and burlap. They stuffed newspaper into their boots for insulation. Feet went numb. Toes turned black. Frostbite claimed soldiers by the dozen. Medics amputated gangrenous limbs in candlelit cellars. The wounded who could not be evacuated died slowly in aid stations that lacked morphine, plasma, and surgical instruments. The garrison faced approximately 54,000 German troops from the 47th Panzer Corps, principally the 26th Volksgrenadier Division under Colonel Heinz Kokott, elements of the Panzer Lehr Division under Major General Fritz Bayerlein, and the 5th Parachute Division. German artillery pounded the perimeter daily. German infantry probed for weak points nightly. On Christmas Eve, the Luftwaffe bombed the town centre, killing a Belgian nurse and destroying the aid station where she worked. At approximately 11:30 on the morning of December 22, 4 German soldiers approached American lines under white flags along the Ardennes road south of Bastogne. They carried a typewritten ultimatum demanding the honourable surrender of the encircled town and threatening annihilation by 1 German artillery corps and 6 heavy anti-aircraft battalions if refused. The demand was transmitted up the chain to division headquarters. Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore woke McAuliffe from sleep. "The Germans have sent some people forward to take our surrender," Moore said. McAuliffe, half awake, muttered a single word. "Nuts." He climbed out of his sleeping bag. When he read the written demand and realized the Germans wanted him to surrender, he erupted. "Us surrender? Oh, nuts." He dropped the message on the floor and left to congratulate a unit that had destroyed a German roadblock. Reminded that a formal reply was needed, McAuliffe said he did not know what to write. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, the Division G3, suggested that what McAuliffe said initially would be hard to beat. The reply, typed on a full sheet and centered, read simply, "To the German commander. Nuts." The American commander, Colonel Joseph Harper of the 327th Glider Infantry, personally delivered it to the blindfolded German officers. When Lieutenant Helmuth Henke of the Panzer Lehr Division asked if the reply was negative or affirmative, Harper said the reply is decidedly not affirmative. A German-speaking medic provided a translation. "You can go to hell," Harper added for emphasis. "If you continue to attack, we will kill every goddamn German that tries to break into this city." The threatened artillery barrage never materialized. General von Luttwitz, the corps commander, lacked the heavy guns to back up his bluff. They had already been moved past Bastogne to support the westward advance. For 7 days, persistent fog, overcast, and snow had grounded nearly 10,000 aircraft of the 9th Air Force. Patton, desperate for air support, had already taken an unconventional step. On December 8th, before the offensive even began, he had telephoned Colonel James Hugh O'Neill, the 3rd Army Chief Chaplain, and asked if he had a good prayer for weather. O'Neill composed an original prayer, printed on 250,000 small cards and distributed throughout the army by mid-December. On December 23, the skies cleared. A high-pressure system moved in, bringing brutally cold but crystal-clear conditions, Patton wrote in his diary. "What a glorious day for killing Germans." Air controllers announced visibility unlimited. Within hours, 241 C-47 transport aircraft from the 9th Troop Carrier Command were over Bastogne, dropping approximately 144 tons of supplies. Ammunition, gasoline, food, and medical equipment drifted down under parachutes while P-47 Thunderbolts savaged German positions across the battlefield. When the weather broke, Patton exclaimed, "That O'Neill sure did some potent praying. Get him up here. I want to pin a medal on him." He personally awarded O'Neill the Bronze Star Medal. The Third Corps counterattack launched at 0600 hours on December 22, approximately 67 hours after the Verdun meeting. Across a 20-mile front in a snowstorm, 3 divisions attacked abreast, the 4th Armoured Division on the western flank, along the Ardennes to Bastogne highway, the 26th Infantry Division in the centre toward Rambroche and Grosbus, the 80th Infantry Division on the eastern flank toward Ettelbruck. Patton urged 3rd Corps Commander Milliken to drive like hell. The 4th Armoured Division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey, bore the heaviest burden. Its 3 combat commands faced the veteran 5th Parachute Division, 16,000 strong, supported by assault guns, and dug into prepared positions along every road and ridge. The first day cost the division 33 tanks to German guns, anti-tank mines, and Panzerfausts. The fighting was savage and attritional. Every crossroads was a battle. Every village was a fortress. The German paratroopers were not conscripts or old men. They were elite troops, the best remaining infantry in the Wehrmacht. They fought from stone farmhouses, from church steeples, from the basements of shattered buildings. They planted mines in the frozen earth and waited for Sherman tanks to roll over them. They held their positions until the last man was dead or captured. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. At Martelange on December 22, Combat Command A found that bridges over the Sauer River had been blown, ironically by retreating American engineers days earlier. German paratroopers raked the crossing sites with Panzerfausts and machine guns from concealed positions on the far bank. Engineers worked under fire to construct a Bailey Bridge, while tankers and infantrymen fought to suppress the defenders. At Chaumont on December 23, Combat Command B walked into a devastating ambush. German anti-tank guns caught the lead tanks in a crossfire on the narrow road. 11 M4 Shermans were knocked out or bogged in mud. The survivors withdrew to regroup while artillery pounded the German positions. At Warnach on December 24, Christmas Eve, Combat Command A fought bitter house-to-house combat. German defenders had fortified every building. Tanks fired point-blank into windows while infantry cleared room by room with grenades and bayonets. 4 more Shermans were lost to Panzerfausts fired from upper stories. The village was a smoking ruin by the time it fell. At Biggenville, Combat Command Reserve's Captain Jimmy Leach led B Company of the 37th Tank Battalion through a gauntlet of Panzerfausts and mortar fire. His tank was hit 3 times but kept moving. Each village consumed tanks, men, and time, and Bastogne was still 12 to 15 miles away. On Christmas Eve, Bradley sent Patton a message. "There is only one more shopping day before Christmas." The taunt underscored the pressure. Patton visited his troops on Christmas Day, ensuring every soldier received a hot turkey dinner. From inside the perimeter, the guns of the relief force could be heard, but not seen. McAuliffe radioed that the finest Christmas present the 101st could get would be a relief tomorrow. By the afternoon of December 26, Combat Command Reserve was positioned near Cloquimont, roughly 5 miles southwest of Bastogne. The 37th Tank Battalion was down to 20 medium tanks. The 53rd Armoured Infantry Battalion was short, approximately 230 men. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams watched C-47 transports dropping parachutes into Bastogne from a nearby hill and made a decision. At approximately 1500 hours, Abrams radioed General Gaffey for permission to bypass the strongly held village of Cibray and drive straight through the less defended Assenois to Bastogne. Permission was granted. At 1520, Abrams ordered his operations officer, Captain William Dwight, to take a light team of tanks and infantry and break northeast through Assenois. Then he climbed into his Sherman tank, named Thunderbolt 4, and radioed his men. "We are going into those people now. Let her roll." 7 artillery battalions, firing an estimated 2,340 shells, pounded Assenois and the woods to the north. Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion took the lead with 9 tanks. The point vehicle was Cobra King, commanded by First Lieutenant Charles Bulge. The column highballed through Cloquimont at full speed, spraying machine gun fire in both directions. Shells were still falling on Assenois when the first tanks entered the village. Infantry dismounted into close combat amid the smoke and falling debris. German soldiers stumbled from shattered buildings, dazed by the bombardment, only to be cut down by machine gun fire. After the first 4 tanks passed through, Germans detonated telemines behind them, destroying a half-track and wounding several soldiers. The column was momentarily cut in two. Captain Dwight leaped from his own tank to personally clear mines so the remaining vehicles could get through. Working under sniper fire with bare hands in the freezing cold, Dwight removed the buried explosives and waved the column forward. North of Assenois, the column pushed through woods where German infantry still fought. Small arms fire rattled off the tank's armor. Tankers fired blindly into the tree line. The half-tracks carrying armored infantry absorbed casualties but kept moving. The objective was too close to stop. At 1650 hours, Bulge's Cobra King reached the Bastogne defense perimeter near a pre-war Belgian concrete bunker. Members of Able Company, 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion, occupied foxholes nearby. The engineers had heard the artillery barrage and the distant sound of tank engines. Now they watched an American Sherman, its main gun still smoking, grind to a halt on the snowy ridge above them. First Lieutenant Dwayne Webster greeted the approaching tankers. An engineer approached the tank and extended his hand. "Glad to see you." 20 minutes later, Lieutenant Colonel Abrams shook hands with Brigadier General McAuliffe. The siege of Bastogne was broken. The corridor, however, was razor-thin. A 4th Armoured Division officer warned correspondents it was so narrow you can spit across it. It would take days of fierce fighting to widen and secure. By the morning of December 27, the road through Assenois was sufficiently cleared for convoys. A relief column of 40 supply trucks and 70 ambulances poured into Bastogne. Wounded soldiers who had waited a week for evacuation were finally loaded aboard. Major General Maxwell Taylor returned with the 4th Armoured Division and resumed command of the 101st Airborne. The human toll of the operation was severe. The 4th Armoured Division lost approximately 1,000 men killed and wounded in the 7-day drive to Bastogne. The 37th Tank Battalion alone suffered 5 killed, 22 wounded, and 5 missing. Company C was reduced to just 4 operational tanks. The 53rd Armoured Infantry Battalion lost 30 killed and 180 wounded. At the end of the relief operation, the division's medium tank strength was equivalent to a single battalion. The 101st Airborne Division suffered 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing during the siege period from December 19 to January 6, 1945. A total of 2,548 casualties. Combat Command B of the 10th Armoured Division added approximately 500 casualties. Across the entire Battle of the Bulge, American forces sustained approximately 75,000 to 89,000 total casualties. Roughly 19,000 killed, 47,500 wounded, and 23,000 captured or missing. German losses ranged from 80,000 to 120,000 by various estimates. Over 15,000 American soldiers suffered cold injuries during the battle. Troops lacked adequate winter gear. They had low combat boots instead of insulated winter boots. They had wool uniforms that were not waterproof. They had no sleeping bags. Water in canteens froze solid. Wounded soldiers could die within 30 minutes if left exposed in the snow. Post-war interrogations and German records offer a revealing perspective on the relief operation. Major General Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Lehr Division, identified 2 critical surprises that derailed the offensive. The first surprise for the Germans was the prompt occupation and strong defense of Bastogne and the brave determination of the 101st Airborne. The second surprise was the rapid turning of the American Third Army against the German southern flank. Bayerlein further assessed Bastogne's strategic impact. "Bastogne was always a thorn in the flesh of the German troops," he said. "The corridor towards the west was too narrow without Bastogne. Strong forces had therefore to be left there as a screen, and therefore were missed by the forces attacking toward the Meuse. The military significance of Patton's relief of Bastogne rests on several pillars. The sheer complexity of the maneuver is almost without precedent. There is no more complex or risk-laden battlefield maneuver than a 90-degree turn and movement across and perpendicular to one's own lines of communication. Patton had to simultaneously maintain defensive operations, facing east with 20th Corps, pivot 2 entire corps northward, establish entirely new supply lines, lay 20,000 miles of new communications wire, distribute 57 tons of maps, and reorient 1,296 artillery pieces, all while engaged with the enemy on multiple fronts and operating in the worst European winter in a generation. A British Army intelligence analyst later observed that you never split your force, you never offer your enemy an opportunity, you never expose a flank, you never purposely cause more logistic problems for yourself. Even proposing it would have got you a severe reprimand at officer school. Patton not only proposed it, he executed it in less than a week. What made this possible was preparation. Colonel Koch's intelligence work had given Patton warning when no other commander saw the danger. The contingency planning that began on December 12 meant that when the crisis came, Patton did not have to improvise. He simply activated a plan that already existed. The Third Army staff, battle-hardened through 2 years of campaigning, could translate Patton's vision into movement orders within hours. The logistical infrastructure, built and refined since Normandy, could reorient supply lines faster than any other army in history. The battle was far from over on December 26. The corridor remained dangerously thin. More than 100,000 German troops ultimately converged on Bastogne. Additional American divisions, the 6th Armored, the 11th Armored, the 35th Infantry, and the 87th Infantry, were rushed in to hold and widen the lifeline. The fighting continued for 3 more weeks. Bastogne was not fully secure until approximately January 17, 1945, when the pincers of 1st and 3rd Armies met at Houffalize. The strategic consequences were catastrophic for Germany. The failed Ardennes offensive consumed 80,000 to 120,000 irreplaceable casualties, over 600 tanks, and 1,500 aircraft. These were the last strategic reserves the Wehrmacht possessed. The Eastern Front, stripped of these forces, collapsed under renewed Soviet offensives. Less than 4 months later, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the tank commander who led the spearhead into Bastogne, went on to command American forces in Vietnam and became Army Chief of Staff in 1972. He died of cancer on September 4, 1974. The M1, Abrams' main battle tank, the backbone of American armored forces for 4 decades, bears his name. The Cobra King, Bulge's Jumbo Sherman, survived the war and is preserved today. McAuliffe received the Distinguished Service Cross from Patton personally on December 30, 1944. The 101st Airborne earned the first presidential unit citation ever awarded to an entire division, with the streamer Bastogne. Winston Churchill called the Battle of the Bulge, undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war. Patton himself assessed the operation with characteristic confidence. When it is considered that we planned 3 possible lines of attack and made a simple code in which I could telephone General Gay, it is evident that war is not so difficult as people think. The remark was vintage Patton, simultaneously arrogant and accurate. What appeared impossible to others was merely difficult to him. Lieutenant Colonel Codman, Patton's aide, wrote what may be the most fitting epitaph. To disengage 3 divisions actually in combat and launch them over more than 100 miles of icy roads straight into the heart of a major attack of unprecedented violence presented problems which few commanders would have undertaken. To resolve in that length of time, Patton undertook them, his staff resolved them, his soldiers executed them. And in the frozen forests of Belgium, in the burning villages along the road to Bastogne, in the faces of exhausted paratroopers who watched a single tank crest a ridge on a December afternoon, the proof was written in blood and snow and steel. The siege was broken. The offensive was stopped. The war would end in Allied victory. And the march that made it possible, the impossible pivot of an entire army in the teeth of a blizzard, became the standard against which military excellence would be measured for generations to come. 80 years later, the relief of Bastogne remains required study at every major war college in the Western world. Cadets at West Point learn the 3 code words. Staff officers at Leavenworth diagram the logistics. And in armored formations across the globe, the name of the M1 tank serves as a daily reminder of what one lieutenant colonel and his battalion achieved on a frozen December afternoon when they rolled through hell to reach the men who were waiting.